Everybody, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from the slopes of Mauna Loa with Mauna Kea there in the background, surrounded by volcanic goo. I was going to go all the way up to the top, but apparently the volcano decided to destroy the road, so whatever. Anyway, that means you get a bonus video. The big news that's happening today, we were seeing this on Sunday the 28th, is that there are presidential elections in Finland, and for the first time ever, they matter. So since the Ukraine war, we haven't had a lot of electoral contests in Europe in the context of the changed security environment. This is really the first one that matters. And it matters for more than one reason. Finland, well, there's a term for it, Finlandization. The idea that you're scared of your bigger neighbor, so you plot a neutral policy in order to make sure that they're not aggravated. And this is the position that Stalin forced upon the Finns back at the end of World War II. And so presidential elections have always been about the debate of just how friendly can we be to the Russians so that they don't decide to invade us. And that has been the case now for over a half century. And the outgoing president was known as the Putin whisperer because she had a tight personal relationship. But with the Ukraine war, that has changed. And Finland is arguably of the real countries, the sizable countries that are assisting the Ukrainians, the one who has provided the most material support per person, as well as leading the charge in terms of diplomatic efforts, and has also jumped on board NATO, which is something that they assiduously avoided for the last 70 years in order to not aggravate the Russians. Now the presidential contest is a beauty contest about who can be the most anti-Russian, who will take the strongest position on any type of security issue. And so we're kind of seeing the debate take place in three general arenas. The first is the Ukraine war proper, who's going to promise more aid, who's going to be more of a hawk. The second one has to do with citizenship. There are a substantial number of dual citizens who are Russian and Finnish citizenship, and the debate at the presidential level now is whether or not to revoke their Finnish citizenship if they do not surrender their Russian citizenship. And that's important enough as it is, but it also is carrying out into European foreign policy because Finland is not the country in Europe that has the largest percentage of ethnic Russians among its population. That would be Latvia, with Estonia and Lithuania coming up in second and third place. So there's always been a little bit of a quiet human rights debate within Europe about the position of the ethnic Russians in those countries, with Finland trying to take the position of the ethnic Russians in order to mollify Moscow. Well, that is not the case anymore. The debate is whether or not these people should be kicked out, whether they should be forced to change languages, whether they should lose their European Union citizenship. The fact that the Finns have changed so much in 2 years is just a testament to just how brutal the war in Ukraine is and how close it hits to home to countries in these regions. Something to consider if you don't live in Eastern Europe. For anyone else in the world, the countries from Finland to Estonia to Latvia to Poland to Romania to Bulgaria, these are the countries who have the most experience in living under Russian rule or fighting the Russians, and they're the ones who have been basically training their military in order to support the Ukrainians in the conflict because they know what happens if they don't. Anyway, by the time you view this, the polls will have opened in Finland, and we should have results in the not-too-distant future as Europe's most neutral country becomes its most aggressive. Oh, one more thing for those of you who are not fueled by issues of democracy versus repression and mass rapes and war. How about illegal migrants? Yeah, so the Russians have been flying people in from South Asia and the Middle East and herding them through the forests of northern Russia and forcing them through the Finnish border. So that really has the Finns all cheesed off too. Everybody, Peter Zeihan here. We are continuing our post-American series about what the world will look like and where the hotspots will be after the United States retrenches from its current position. Coming to you from the Eagle's Nest Wilderness just below Gore Lake. And today we are going to discuss the East Asian Rim. This one's a little bit of an anomalous issue considering the series, but whatever. In that this is an area that the Americans are going to remain very engaged. In part of it, it's about managing the Chinese decline, but in part it's because the United States has a couple of very powerful, creative, capable allies that Americans appreciate. The first one is Australia, which is arguably the staunchest ally the United States has. And it has always, well, for the last 50 years at least, served as a bit of a a deputy for American interest in Southeast Asia, which is a region that the United States is interested in, but has never really had the time to give the amount of attention that it deserves, and that's where the Australians come in. They've got excellent relations with most of the countries in the region, most notably Singapore and Indonesia. And then, of course, you've got New Zealand there as a sidekick. Part of the reason that the United States has given nuclear-powered submarines and a free trade deal to the Australians is because they've been so loyal and so long in areas that are out of theater. They participated in Vietnam and Korea. They participated in Iraq and Afghanistan. They've always been there because they know at the end of the day, if they don't have a partnership with the Americans, then they are on their own, and they can read a map and they realize they're wildly outnumbered in the region. So it is a strategy that they've been following for decades. It's a strategy that has borne a lot of fruit, and it's a strategy that will continue to serve them well into the future. The other country is more of a newcomer, and that's Japan. Now, throughout the Cold War, the Japanese were a bit combination of seething and shell-shocked. They had been defeated soundly in World War II. They had been nuked twice, which was something that didn't happen to Nazi Germany, and the post-war settlements were, if anything, harsher on the Japanese than they were on the Germans. And so there's always this lingering nationalist ideal in Japan that wanted to move beyond the American alliance network of the Cold War. But between the defeat, the occupation, American military force, and the Soviets and the Chinese right there, they never really had that choice. Well, over the last 15 years, politics in Japan have evolved. It's not that the nationalism is gone, no. But the Chinese have become a much more clear and present danger than they thought the Chinese could ever be. And the Russians, with their weakness in the Ukraine war, are showing themselves to be wobbly, which means that the Japanese have become very thoughtful about what their possibilities might become, that some things may not be what they thought, some might be harder, some might be easier. And in that sort of mindset, when you're dealing with a demographic that is in terminal decline, you realize you probably are not going to be able to go it alone, so it's best to look for partners who are going to see the world through a similar lens. And that has led them willingly back to the United States. Over the course of the last 15 years, the Japanese have built a pair of very large carriers, not quite super carriers, but the aircraft that operate from them are the Joint Strike Fighter that is made in the United States. And the Japanese gotten closer and closer and closer and managed to strike a deal both with the Trump and with the Biden administration on the future of bilateral relations. So it's not that Japan is not capable. It's the second most powerful navy in the world by most measures. It's that Japan has chosen that rather than going it alone, it's opening them the door on a protracted partnership with the United States and with Australia. And that puts major American power at 3 points of the Pacific, bracketing nicely where the Russians are and where the Chinese are. So for the future of this region, it's going to come down to how powers do or do not get along with the trilateral alliance. Some, like the Chinese, are destined to break, not probably because of military confrontation, but because of their own internal issues, which means this is going to be a zone of chaos, opportunity, carpetbagging, for those of you who bothered to learn Mandarin, something like that. It's going to be impossible to put troops on the ground and stabilize something the size of China, even if you wanted to. So it's probably just going to be a security black hole for a good long time. And then there's other powers like Taiwan or Korea that get along pretty well with the United States and, to a lesser degree, the Japanese, but are going to have to decide just how hand in glove they want to work. This is one of those things that popped up earlier this year when the Biden administration had the Japanese and the Koreans to Camp David to basically hammer out a peace deal that dates back not to World War II, but to 1905, when the Japanese occupied and colonized the Koreans. If the Japanese and the Koreans can agree to get along, then we can have a mini globalization in East Asia, because Taiwan's almost a rounding error at that point, that also involves Southeast Asia. But if the Koreans decide to go a different direction, then there's a very big security problem, because the Japanese will never be secure so long as the Koreans are a hostile power. So a lot of this remains an act in progress, but we're starting to see the outlines of a post-Russia, post-Chinese Asia already, and it speaks with an Australian and a Japanese accent. All right, that's it. Bye. Hey everybody, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from the winter wonderland that is Colorado after a snowstorm. It is the 8th of January, and the news today is that the Indian Navy has successfully engaged in a counter-pirate operation and freed a vessel with a majority Indian crew from pirates off the coast of Somalia. This is nearly at the outer reach of what the Indians can reach, which are the naval forces, and counter-piracy operations are always lots of no fun for everyone. And so this is a pretty important tactical victory, and I think it underlines the role that I see India playing in the region in the future. Now, India is not like any other country in the world. It's certainly not like the United States. They have a very nationalist view of trade, and they don't like to integrate with anyone. And they had an ideological opposition to globalization because it was American-led, and during the Cold War, the Indians tended to be more pro-Soviet. To the point that even when the Soviet Union wasn't around anymore, the Indians tended to be fairly pro-Soviet. But we've seen this weakening in that position over the course of the Ukraine war, not because they're having a change of heart, but because they're realizing that all of the billions of dollars that they spent on developing joint weapons systems with the Russians was basically stolen, and they're never going to get any of it. So the Indians, from a national security point of view, are increasingly going their own way. That may include some deals here and there with the United States, but those will be tactical, not strategic. And it's going to be a very a la carte experience as opposed to, say, the American relationship with Japan or with Australia or even with Saudi Arabia. India is going to do its own things for its own ways. Also, India doesn't really like anyone, and there aren't a lot of countries out there that like India, so they won't be partnering with anyone else in economic matters for manufacturing. They're going to have to do more or less the same thing that the U.S. is going to have to do as the Chinese system breaks down, and that means doubling the size of their industrial plant, but they're not going to have a joint manufacturing system with Bangladesh or with Pakistan or Sri Lanka or with Iran or with Myanmar, and those are all the countries that they border. So India's industrial plant is going to expand massively, but it's all going to be in India. That will affect quality issues, of course, but, India is a market with 1.5 billion people. I think they're going to deal with that just fine. What that does mean, however, is their threshold for military action is going to be very, very low compared to a lot of other countries because they're not integrated with anyone. They're also the first major stop for oil going out of the Persian Gulf to East Asia, which is where it almost all goes. And now the Indians have conclusively demonstrated that they're capable of doing anti-pirate operations. Well, not to put too fine a point on it, but if you're good at anti-pirate operations, you're also by default very good at pirate operations. So now that the Indians are not beholden to anyone, and now that we are seeing a breakdown in the Chinese system, we're going to see the Indians taking not de facto control, but de facto management of any trade that happens to come through the Indian Ocean Basin. And that includes the world's largest oil transport route. So the issue for everyone else in the area is whether or not you can find a way of dealing with the Indians. And to be perfectly blunt, the best way to do that is cold hard cash, because the Indians are otherwise more or less going to be self-sufficient in the world that we're going to. And no one can reach them. They're literally a continent away from all the other potential players. And as for the United States, if we have an India that is a little bit, that's the best word, persnickety in its own region, that's fine, because there aren't a lot of U.S. interests that pass through that region in a post-China scenario. So this is just where we're headed. And the Indians, very clearly, are a step ahead of everyone else. Everyone, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from home, and I have received, no surprise here, lots and lots of questions about Tucker Carlson's interview with the Russian leader Vladimir Putin. There's really no point in going to the substance of Tucker's interview. A couple things to keep in mind about Tucker Carlson. Number one, he's been fired from every journalistic job that he has ever had for making things up. And his legal defense when he was working at Fox in recent years was that he's not a journalist at all. So he's not responsible for any sort of fact-based reporting. In fact, he literally called himself a propagandist. Which, I guess if you're going to go for a legal defense, being truthful helps. And he's been a Russian shill for several years. So the idea that he was being a Russian shill in Russia doesn't really shock me. And it was just an example of how Putin can get his message out in front of a relatively favorable audience in the United States to stir the political pot and keep the United States unable to make a broad-based response to anything that the Russians are doing. And this is not a new program. The Russians have been doing this ever since they formed the bot farm over a decade ago. More importantly is the strategic picture that we have in the Russian space right now. The Ukraine war is not at a stalemate. It hasn't been for any part of this war. We've been seeing new tactics and new weapon systems moving. The current iteration is the Russians are combining their meat assaults, as they've been called, with a much better level of coordination with other tactics, especially with artillery. One of the things to keep in mind about the Ukraine war is that we've got two very different approaches. On the Ukrainian side, authority has been devolved down to almost the unit level. But when you disassociate your military strategy to that level, yes, you'll get a lot of creative people who are doing creative things that are very effective. But the information and the successes that they have, the techniques don't necessarily percolate back up to the top, which means that it's hard for the folks at the top to then apply those tactics across the entire front. So you get very, very effective commanders, but you don't necessarily get a very, very effective army. Russia has the opposite approach in that there's very little authority at the local level. And so they often have the Ukrainians running circles around them. But whenever a lesson does percolate up to the top, it is then imposed on everyone. And for the first couple of years of the war, this has definitely been working for the Ukrainians' favor. But as the Russians incrementally incorporate lessons, it's now starting to favor the Russians. And the only way that you can kind of make the Ukrainians come up again, two things. Number one, you can get them better at a little bit of command and control. And then second, of course, they need better and better weapons in order to counter what is becoming an incrementally more effective Russian war machine. That, of course, is wrapped up with politics in the Western countries, especially the United States, which is one of the many, many, many reasons that Putin arranged for his shill to come and interview him in order to keep stirring the pot so the United States would have more and more problems when it comes to acting. Just as important, arguably more important, is the Russians are thrilled about what's going on with Israel and Gaza and Iran, because every little bit of attention that the Americans give to the Israeli situation or the Gaza situation or the attacks on maritime shipping in the Red Sea is an attention that they can't give to the Ukraine war. One of the things that people forget about the American foreign policy establishment, it really has a hard time dealing with more than one issue at a time. And so for the first 16, 18 months of the Ukraine war, that was the only issue in international affairs that was in front of Joe Biden. You could argue that things with China were up there, but that was mostly in the area of economic nationalism, and that is something that can be handed off to non-foreign policy personnel. But in the United States, there's really only three people who are responsible for almost all American foreign policy. The president, obviously, the chair of the Federal Reserve, and that's usually focused on economic issues for obvious reasons, and the national security advisor. Even the Secretary of State really doesn't deal with foreign affairs. It's more of a dispensation rather than a policy creation sort of issue. And so when you only have three people, and one of them obviously has other things on his plate at any given time, and one of them is only responsible for financial and economic issues, it's really hard to get this mammoth institution of the United States focused on more than one thing at the same time. And if Israel and Gaza and Iran are absorbing more and more and more of that attention, then by default, there's less attention that can be paid to things going on in the Russian sphere. So the Russians have, from the fourth quarter of last year on, discovered that they have a lot more wiggle room because the leadership out of the United States is simply lacking. It's not that we've had a policy change in Washington. It's just that there's only so much bandwidth. And of course, now we're in an election year, and that snarls things even more. So ignore Tucker. You should have been ignoring Tucker for years, but do watch Moscow, because they're finding new and more creative ways, not simply to prosecute the word home, but to muddle the picture on a broader global scale, to play into this fact that the Americans have a hard time focusing on more than one thing.
Civil stability doesn't matter until the day that it does. The only way that a Russian government changes course is when it collapses. I don't see us being there yet. Doesn't mean we won't reach that point. And Putin has gutted the Russian elite over the last 25 years. There are probably only about 110, 120 people left with any sort of authority. And most of them are over 55. So we are looking at the final age of the Russian government, but that doesn't mean it's going to collapse on Friday.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And this time we're catching up with the geopolitical analyst, Peter Zeihan. Peter is a best-selling author whose most recent book is The End of the World is Just the Beginning, Mapping the Collapse of Globalization. Peter, good to speak to you. Last time we met, it was for our special marking the anniversary of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Let's start then with this Tucker Carlson interview, the interview with President Putin. How I know I don't really want to give him much publicity, but how much has it been noticed or talked about in the US?
You're having the normal people who have decided that despite Tucker being fired from every job he's ever been, and despite his legal defense here in the United States being that he's not a journalist, so he doesn't have to say anything that's accurate. In fact, his legal defense is I am allowed to lie, I'm encouraged to lie on television because I'm a propagandist. The people who think he's still great are talking about him, and everyone else has basically ignored it. And that's really the end of the story here.
Yeah, and the former head of MI6, Britain's Secret Intelligence Service here in the UK, Sir Alex Younger, he was on the radio just in the aftermath of this and said it was unforgivably boring. Did it actually achieve anything?
It achieves some clarity. We've always known that on this side of the pond that Tucker Carlson has been a Russian shill for a few years. But between not just his interview, but what he has done since the interview, he is now going out and doing Soviet-style propaganda pieces in Russia, talking about how glorious Russian life is in Moscow under sanctions. And this is the sort of things that you would have seen in the Soviet Union in the 1950s or the 1970s. And for him to have fallen so far so fast, I mean, it's a little embarrassing for him. But it gives you an idea that the Russians really are having some issues working some of their assets in the West. I'm not suggesting that the propaganda effort has not made gains, but they really have to go to kind of a lower tier of viewer if they're going to get any traction.
Let's talk about Donald Trump now for a moment, making shockwaves with his comments about NATO, effectively encouraging President Putin to attack alliance members who failed to spend 2% of their GDP on defense. Has that been reported much in the US?
Oh, yes, that is loud.
And what has the reaction been exactly?
A kind of horror from the point of view of folks in the center, which I think is not entirely honest, if we're going to speak candidly here. One of the problems that people in the rest of the world, especially in Europe, have kind of forgotten is that the amount of time that most NATO countries had just kind of treated the alliance as a side piece really did erode confidence in the Americans and what the Europeans would do when the rubber would hit the road. And while I am certainly a strong supporter of the alliance, especially now because of the Ukraine war, and I've definitely seen a lot of the allies step up, unless there's a significant increase in European commitment and willing to get blood in the game, what Trump said may have been a little vainglorious, but that is the future. For NATO to function, it needs to be more than an American alliance. And in my first book, The Accidental Superpower, I talk about how the Americans are losing confidence in the alliance because of this issue. Now, if it had been anyone but Trump who would have said it, it would have probably triggered a lot more soul searching because Trump goes for things for the public pizzazz. But the issue is a very, very real one. And treating this as just a Trump issue, I think, isn't going to do anyone any good.
But if he does, in fact, become the next US president, what influence do you think he will have over the future of NATO? What do you think actions he might take?
Trump made it very clear, unofficially, in the last 6 months of his first term, that if he was reelected on his first day, he would pull the United States out of NATO. Now, I don't think Trump personally has much of a chance of winning the second round, and that assuming he's not in prison. But if he were to win, yes, NATO would lose the United States.
So let's talk about funding for Ukraine, because after weeks of setbacks, the US Senate has finally given its approval for the $60 billion aid package as part of an overall $95 billion wartime aid package. It still has to get through the House of Representatives, though. How much focus is President Biden in his administration paying to Ukraine at the moment, do you think?
The problem with the United States political system when it comes to foreign policy is we're really only able to function and focus on one issue at a time. There's really only three people in the American political system who have a role in terms of policy making for foreign policy. You've got the National Security Advisor, the President himself, and the Federal Reserve Chief. And they just can't deal with multiple crises. There's not enough bandwidth. So because we now have Iran and the Gaza war happening at the same time, and because the Chinese degradation has accelerated, the Ukraine war by default has taken a back seat. It's not that it's not a priority, it's just that it's not the priority anymore. And without authorization from Congress, there's only so much the administration can do in terms of assistance. Now, what we're probably going to see in the House is you'll get an effort for what's called a disclosure petition, which will force a vote even if the Speaker doesn't want to bring the bill to the floor. But that's going to take at least another month. And what that will mean is that the moderate Republicans who are already getting hammered by the hard right will basically be labeled as Republicans in name only again, because they will have to support this with centrist Democrats to get this through. I have no doubt that some version of that will happen, but it's not going to happen tomorrow. It's not going to happen this month. We're probably not going to see new aid for Ukraine until April.
And what effect do you think that will have on Ukraine?
Well, anything that's going to get ammo in their artillery tubes is going to be what they need. What we've seen in battles like Avdiivka is that the Ukrainians have gone from almost artillery parity, which has allowed them to inflict 8-1 to 10-1 casualty ratios on the Russians, to something much more closer to parity because they can't fire artillery at all. They've been relying on these little 2-pound drones that they've been mass producing, and that's great, but those drones only have a range of a couple of miles, sorry, Britain, about 3 kilometers, versus the artillery, which has a range closer to 40 kilometers.
Just to go back to that, so you are confident then that this aid package will actually be agreed then, but they'll have to wait till April, is that right?
Right. We have to basically do an end run around a faction in Congress. Sorry. This is kind of a treat for me as an American, because we've had to follow the ins and outs of your parliament's procedures for the last 7 years. Now you get to do it for us. Okay. So the way the American system works is if you want to get a majority in the House of Representatives, it's not a majority of the votes. It's a majority of the seats. And we have a number of vacancies. So for the Republicans to get something through, they need every single vote minus one. If they lose more than one of their members, they can't get anything through. So you've got this cluster of about a dozen people out of the 300 Republicans who are in the chamber who are willing to block everything, not Ukraine. They're not blocking Ukraine. They're blocking everything. And so this has now been the least productive Congress we have ever had in our country's history. And doing an end run around the American Republican manager of the House, the Speaker, is not something that is done lightly, because it usually means that the Speaker gets kicked out within a few weeks, and we are already on our 5th for this Congress. So deciding to pull that legislative trick means that we basically commit to the House of Representatives falling apart again. So they want to be very careful when they decide to go for this petition that this is the issue that they really want to die on.
And when you get moves by the UK's Foreign Secretary, David Cameron, making this direct appeal, as he did to Republicans in the US, to not show the weakness displayed against Hitler in the 1930s, and you have Grant Shapps saying the world's dictators are watching, does that actually have any traction in the US at all?
It does, not with the 12 people who are boycotting action, but it does with the mainline Republicans who realize what is at stake in Ukraine.
Okay, that's good to know. Ukraine's military intelligence has this week confirmed that it has sunk a Russian Navy landing ship close to the Russian-controlled Crimean Peninsula in the Black Sea. How important is it at this moment for Ukraine to demonstrate it can still take the fight to the Russians?
I don't think it's so much of a public relations issue. I think it's just an evolution of the weapons issue. One of the things that we've seen over the course of the last 18 months is the Ukrainian drone industry has really come into its own. It's holding the line at Avdiivka in a way that we didn't think was possible. And the ship that was sunk with a fundamentally new drone, which was basically a modified jet ski, something that was not in their arsenal 6 weeks ago. So the Ukrainians aren't just showing that they can hit at longer and longer ranges, but it's with more and more novel weapon systems. I think the weapon systems to watch for the most, the ones where we're going to be seeing the greatest impact on the Russians, aren't naval, though. They're these long-range air drones that are now striking chemical and energy facilities across the length and the breadth of the Russian coastline, which should be the part of the Russian system that has the best air defense. Western sanctions have had an impact on Russian energy exports, but not nearly as dramatic as what the Ukrainians have done by hitting a few fuel depots and fractionating columns.
And these parts of the campaign that you describe, it comes after a major shake-up of the Ukrainian armed forces, with the Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief, General Valery Zaluzhny, replaced by General Alexander Syrsky, and 4 new other appointments in the military. What is President Zelensky trying to achieve exactly?
This is something that is a little concerning, not because I think he's made a horrible mistake or anything, but anytime you see political instability in the midst of a war, you have to be a little concerned. The outgoing folks were fairly competent and fairly politically popular. The new ones are relatively untested. But I don't want to overstate this. Whenever you have a lot of changes in tactics and strategy, especially with the dynamism of the circumstances among the allies, you're going to want to have different people in different positions regularly. The question is, what does that do to the morale of the troops? And because we've had basically the same 2 divisions fighting the Russians nonstop for 14 months now, the morale of those people is everything. So we're going to know very, very quickly whether this is going to have a positive or negative impact or otherwise. In terms of the implications for democracy, I don't see any, because these are appointed military positions. These are not civilian administrators. I wouldn't be worried at all about Zelensky and democracy until and unless they decide to not have elections. And then that's a very different conversation.
You mentioned morale. This General Syrsky, he apparently, from what I understand, is not popular with the troops. His nickname is the Butcher because of his reputation for his lack of concern for their welfare. He is trying to change that because he's been sort of promoting a kind of image of being more caring as a military leader. It's extremely important given the pressing need to recruit more troops.
No, that's absolutely the concern. And the tactics that he has expressed in the past are wildly appropriate to the front of today, but that doesn't mean that they would be inappropriate to the front of tomorrow. So the question is whether he is capable of changing tactics and operational strategy based on circumstances. We will know very soon. And if the answer is no, then he will not be there very long.
He's just visited the front line in the east of the country with Ukraine's defense minister and described the situation as precarious. What challenges does he face?
Without the ammo that is necessary to hold back the Russians in multiple places, the Ukrainians have really had to ration what they have and focus on these drone assaults. The strength of the Ukrainian system militarily is that they've really devolved a lot of decision-making to the local level, but the local level can only do so much if they have limited ammo. So if we don't see a change in the military supplies soon, that local authority will evolve very, very quickly into a mass rout. Because as soon as one group decides to pull out because they can't shoot back, there's no reason then to expect the others to stick around. That's the trick here. And I'm not sure that Syrsky has an answer for that. But I am not a tactical guy and I am not on the front. But that is why this is all precarious. Now, luckily, the Ukrainians have spent the last 6 months doing a bit of a shadow of what the Russians have done for the last 18 months and building up a series of minefields behind their positions to retard any sort of rapid advance. So I don't think we'd be looking at a collapse of the front, but we could see a lot more movement than we've seen in the last year.
And one of the challenges that General Syrsky is facing is the reform of the Ukrainian army, and Zelensky wants a plan. What needs to be done, and how does its command and control structure stack up against what the Russians are doing and how they've changed as we go into the 3rd year?
That's a good example of where Syrsky might actually be the right guy for the job. So he has his background a little bit more rooted in the Soviet system of top-down control, and to this point that would not have worked for the Ukrainians. That local control, the local decision-making, the local innovations is what has allowed the Ukrainians to do well in the face of just massive odds. And against them has been a top-down control from the Russian system, which has wildly underperformed. But we're not in the first year of the war anymore. And as we enter year 3, what we're discovering is the lack of top-down control in Ukraine has prevented the lessons from each individual unit from coming up to the top, being turned into a broader strategy, and then percolating down to everyone. On the opposite side, on the Russian side, every once in a while, a lesson does come up through the top against all odds and penetrates the generals' heads at the very, very top. And they're like, yeah, that actually works. Let's have everyone do that. It's slow, it's painful, it's inefficient, but it means incrementally the Russians are getting better. And when they get better, everyone gets better. So the balance between the two has started to flip. And the Ukrainians are going to have to figure out how to translate local successes into a broader strategic approach. And that is the new guy's primary job. If he can pull that off, you combine Russian top-down coordination with local innovation, then we're in a different game.
And you know, people watching the war quite closely have been saying that the actions and how much he commits to defending Avdiivka will be very key, because he is the man who at all costs defended Bakhmut, and we know what happened there. And what do you think line he will take on Avdiivka, and how important is that as symbolic of the way he's going to operate as a military leader?
That's a great comparison, and I'm not sure it really paints him in the best, well, it doesn't paint him in the best light, but I'm not sure it's entirely fair. So in the defense of Bakhmut, keep in mind that the casualty ratios from the Russians to the Ukrainians was 7-1. So we can easily say that, you know, he should have ordered a pullout earlier and to try to avoid some Ukrainian casualties. But we are at the moment in a war of attrition. And as long as we're in a war of attrition, those are exactly the sorts of numbers that the Ukrainians need. Anything less than that, honestly, is a loss for them, because the demographic overhang of the Russians versus the Ukrainians is so huge. So far at Avdiivka, we're probably looking at an even higher number, probably 8-1 to 10-1. That's exactly the position we need to be. As long as the Ukrainians are trapped in a battle of attrition, this is what has to happen. The ideal is that the Ukrainians will be able to turn this into a battle of movement. But in order to do that, they have to be able to break through the lines in the first place. And at the moment, they do not have the gear to do that.
In a recent interview, the Russian ambassador to London, Andrei Kelin, said that Russia cannot be beaten, bragging its resources are enormous. I know he would say this, but it has lost more than 3,000 tanks, according to a London-based think tank, since the start of the full-scale invasion. Is there no price too high for Russia?
No, there is not. From the Russian point of view, unless they can achieve something similar to their old Soviet perimeter, their country's indefensible. And they're right. The Russian Federation on its own has 8,000 kilometers of exposed borders. But if they can advance through Ukraine into Romania, Poland, and the Balts, that shrinks from 8,000 down to about 800. And with their less competent military, that is something that they can plug. They're not necessarily fighting this war for this war. They're fighting this war in order to achieve a securable perimeter for when their demographics fall apart over the course of the next 20 years. It's not a stupid plan. And that means that the Russians will not stop until they reach there, or they're forced to stop. In terms of the hardware they have, yes, they've lost 3,000 tanks. That's probably the sum total of their entire pre-war operational inventory. But they have at least another 9,000 that they can refurbish in addition to anything they can bring online. So they can maintain this pace for at least another 8 to 10 years. And then there's also the manpower issue. Yes, they've lost dead and wounded probably close to 500,000 so far, but they have another 7 to 8 million men in their 20s that haven't fled yet. So again, 8 to 10 years is how long they can keep this up, and they will keep it up until they can't.
Yeah, I mean, the Russian public is paying a high price for this war.
Yes.
We have an election coming up in Russia. We know what the conclusion will be. But how important is it that in that election, President Putin is at least seen to be winning comfortably and have the support of it? Because the ordinary person, the electricity is going off. They're having all kinds of problems outside the big cities. So it could be a precarious time, could it not, for President Putin?
To be perfectly blunt, you Brits have been duking it out with the Russians a lot longer than us Americans. You know how high their tolerance for pain is. Civil stability doesn't matter until the day that it does. The only way that a Russian government changes course is when it collapses. I don't see us being there yet. Doesn't mean we won't reach that point. And Putin has gutted the Russian elite over the last 25 years. There are probably only about 110, 120 people left with any sort of authority. And most of them are over 55. So we are looking at the final age of the Russian government, but that doesn't mean it's going to collapse on Friday.
You previously, in this interview, you said that the US lacks the bandwidth or words to that effect to deal with more than one foreign policy crisis at a time. What do you think the consequences might be of that for Europe at this time?
Well, the French keep saying that they want European sovereignty when it comes to defense issues. There's an opportunity here, but there's really not a lot that the Europeans can do in the short term, short being in the next several weeks, in order to change the American conversation here. What is required is a deep commitment to defense in the light of the idea that the Russians are coming for Warsaw and nukes are part of the conversation now. It's not just on the fringes. Now we're seeing movement out of Germany. Just in the last week, they've announced that they're basically increasing their defense spending by almost a third, and at a single leap have managed to get back up over that 2% threshold that they've been avoiding for so long. That's a great step. Can you You're a Brit. Of course, you can imagine what the German procurement system looks like when they decide to do that. That needs to happen in another dozen countries in Western Europe, not in Central Europe. The Central Europeans have already done that. The only way you're going to change the conversation of the United States is make it numerically obvious that the situation has changed. Now, we have seen that to a degree with European funding for Ukraine. The Europeans have massively stepped up in the last year and have now providing significantly more aid than the Americans, even before the Americans had this congressional problem. But in terms of policy, the coordinating function of Europe in NATO versus the United States and NATO just broadly doesn't exist. And that's got to change.
And in terms, you mentioned Germany, might it actually not be such a bad thing that the US forces Europe to get more serious about its own defense right now? And also referring back to the kind of things that the potential President Trump had said. This week, the boss of Germany's Rheinmetall, its biggest defense firm, told the BBC that ammunition stocks are currently empty and that Europe will need 10 years before it can be fully ready to defend itself, which is quite a frightening comment to make.
Well, from an American point of view who views himself as a bit of a historian, I see both. I both don't take this very seriously, and I'm very scared of where it might lead. The Germans have proven in times past, when they feel the need, that they can turn around their entire military industrial complex in a matter of months. And if the funding is now there, then it's just an issue of building the industrial plant, and that is something the Germans do better than anyone else in the world, including the Chinese. So, if the decision has been made, Germany is back in the game as a major military industrial player. In the case of the Ukraine war, that would obviously have been an unalloyed positive. But as an American who knows his history, the idea of Germany being in the game as a military player in the center of Europe does make me a little nervous. So for this to work in a way that it doesn't generate the next problem, it has to not just be Germany.
Denmark is the most recent country to raise concerns over NATO going to war with Russia in the near future, and several other countries have done the same, as has the chair of NATO's military committee. How realistic do you think that prospect is?
It's a very realistic fear. The Europeans have been deliberately downplaying the threat of a direct confrontation with the Russians ever since the war began, because they didn't really know how the war was going to go. Now that the Ukrainians are on the back foot to a degree, and there's a real concern that we could see a break in the favor of the Russians, there was always a recognition in NATO capitals that if Ukraine falls, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, Poland, and Romania are next. That is the only way that the Russians get to the position where they feel they need to be. And so now that Ukraine is looking weaker, preparing the population for what is the next logical step in this conflict is smart. I just hope it's sufficiently jarring to get everyone to step up militarily in terms of training, recruitment, and procurement.
What are the main developments that you're looking for in 2024? What are you going to be looking out for?
Number one, it's a question of the military complex in Europe. If the Europeans can build out the capacity to get 1 million artillery shells to the Ukrainians every 2 or 3 months, that is what's necessary. So we're talking about building out the capacity of building that stuff by a factor of 5 minimum. On the United States side, we have a much harder decision to make. We, like Europe, are running out of the older equipment that we've been handing over to the Ukrainians so far. Probably 70 to 80% of our aid to Ukraine to this point has been outdated equipment that we never used. And so from a budgetary point of view, it's been a non-issue. We're running out of that, which means that we have to make a choice. Number one, we either build up our military industrial complex to build outdated equipment to continue to supply the Ukrainians, or we delve into our top line stuff. And if we do that, the logistical and the support tail that is required to train the Ukrainians, much less support the Ukrainians, has to expand massively. We're only now starting to have that conversation. We will probably have an answer before we get to the presidential election, which will of course be shaped by politics. But the equipment that the Ukrainians have been fighting with to this point, there's no more of it to be had. And figuring out how we get to the next stage is going to be very, very, very difficult.
Peter Zeihan, it's been great talking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. My thanks to our producers today, Louis Sykes and Morgan Burdick, and for you for watching. If you'd like to support us, you can subscribe now, or you can listen to Times Radio for the latest news and in-depth analysis, or go to thetimes.co.uk. For now, though, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.